Thank you. Thank you to Reverend Hayward for your insights this morning. We greatly appreciate your support of the initiative and for you being here today. My name is Costa Angelakis. I'm a member of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. Hannah Campiano and I worked on this panel focusing on the institutions and rules surrounding cultural heritage, particularly as it relates to religion and international affairs. Thank you to Hannah, and thank you to all our panelists for being here today. We also have Dr. Bushanaki joining remotely, so we'll get him up in a moment. We have an esteemed group of experts ready to delve into these topics today, so I'll hand things off to our moderator discussant, Dr. Prodromou, in a moment. Just as a brief introduction, Dr. Prodromou is the co-president of Religions for Peace, as well as a visiting scholar in the International Studies program at Boston College and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eraser Center. She also previously served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and with the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. We'll keep the remainder of the introduction short because we're running a little bit over on time, but all our speakers' bios are available online, and we'll also keep the information projected above once we put the panel up. We'll save some time for audience questions at the end, please save them for then if you can. But for now, I'm looking forward to a great discussion and hearing from our panelists. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Prodromou.
Thank you, Costa, and welcome to everyone. It's always great to be back at Fletcher as a double jumbo from Tufts and the Fletcher School. So welcome to all. I want to begin by welcoming our distinguished panelists here, whom I'll introduce momentarily, and also by thanking Costa and Hannah for their work, their yeoman's work on this first panel, but also the entire RLD student club leadership, Costa, Hannah, Ciara, and Katinye. It's been a year since we first talked about the topic for this year's annual conference. And after Dr. Hayward's really fantastic introduction on the significance of religious literacy and being religiously literate in general as students of and practitioners of international relations, I wanted to just say a little bit about the background to how we got to this topic. And you'll see that it seamlessly relates to Dr. Hayward's articulation of the significance of religious literacy. We talked last year about things that were happening around the world as they related to cultural and religious heritage and how those were absent in some ways from our understanding of and our study of the significance of religion and culture and international relations. And just to give you a sense of some of the diversity of things that we talked about, we mentioned, for example, contested religious sites, for example, the Ayodhya Mosque in India. We talked about the contestation of the reversion of the Hagia Sophia Church to a mosque in Turkey. We talked about controversies in the United States over statuary and the names and images on buildings. We talked about controversies in Europe about imagery inside state buildings, a whole host of things. And ultimately, we were interested in coming to a better understanding of what is the meaning of cultural heritage and what are the diverse professional sectors in which cultural and religious heritage matters for foundational issues of peace in this world, for understanding heritage as a trigger for violence and conflict, or other forms, as Dr. Hayward pointed out, of non-violent but systemic discrimination, so indirect forms of violence, and also the ways in which heritage, both tangible and intangible forms of heritage, could be sources of integration, cohesion, pluralism, and peace, rather than the opposite of those. So that was the background to this fantastic panel, which is going to be focusing on governance. If you'll indulge me, I just want to make 4 points about things that I think will run through your presentations and then follow neatly from Dr. Hayward's presentation. The first is, what is cultural heritage? The meaning of cultural and religious heritage. We tend to think of heritage as primarily focused on inanimate objects, on sites. But even there, our definitions are oftentimes very limited. So we tend to focus, for example, on worship sites. But I would add in things that, and all of you have worked on these, like museums, schools, libraries, cemeteries, statuary, and land, and the overall ecology and environment as part of tangible cultural heritage. And then I would ask us to think a little bit about intangible cultural and religious heritage. For example, worship practices, music, architecture, engineering, texts, masonry, woodworking, iconography, calligraphy. You'll see herein diverse sectors in which cultural and religious heritage intangible is practiced and perpetuated. The next thing is the timeline for thinking about cultural and religious heritage. Again, we tend to think and read more about the preservation or protection of sites, and oftentimes looking backward for memorializing. Indeed, memorializing is absolutely important, but I think it's important for us to recognize continuity of timeline so that memory is also about sustainability, and protection and preservation, which allows memorialization, oftentimes is the means also for sustainability and perpetuation. So thinking of an open-ended timeline, history as continuous, and also history as something that we can learn from and correct and hopefully do better on as we move forward. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about, mention a little bit for our speakers and for us to think about in listening to them, of the diverse sectors in which cultural and religious heritage is practiced, understood, protected, or sometimes window dressed and disregarded. And that includes in states and in legislatures, in executive branches, in the military and the armed services, by non-state actors, NGOs, political and social movements, religious movements, in international and transnational organizations, in the private sector. We hear more and more about ESG, for example, and I think now an increasingly, passe term, corporate social responsibility, but in the private sector. And then also the media. Does the media, in the Saidian sense of the word, help to cover or uncover the significance and the various meanings and locations of cultural and religious heritage, and ultimately its significance for what brings us all here together today, and that is for human dignity, the respect for all peoples, for the entire created order, and also for peace in this world. So that is a segue to the brilliance of these four speakers. And I urge you to look at their bios. They're remarkable and they're incredibly diverse. We begin with Yanis Avramidis from the World Monuments Fund. We will then go to Aviva Rosenthal, who is the director of the Smithsonian's Office of International Relations. We'll go to Joseph Klingler, who is a fellow Fletcher alum and who's a partner in the global law firm of Holy Hoag. And then finally, we'll conclude with Dr. Munir Bushanaki, who is a special advisor to the UNESCO. He was special advisor to the UNESCO Secretary General, Director General, and he has a lifetime of work on cultural heritage issues. And going back to beginning with Yanis Avramidis at the World Monuments Fund, he's their senior director of programs. And as you'll see from his bio, he has worked pretty much everywhere on the planet on issues related to cultural and religious heritage. So with no further ado, I introduce our speakers and invite you to enjoy.
Thank you. Looks like I'm on. Flashcards. Yes, thank you. Oh, and this is for the slides. Perfect. Yes, thanks again. Very grateful to be here today. Thanks to everyone who organized this for inviting me. I've been asked to speak about a few different things today, so I will move through them deliberately. And the first thing I'd like to do, if I can have my first slide, would be to tell you about World Monuments Fund, where I work, Senior Director for Programs. It's a World Monuments Fund is a private organization that has the mission to safeguard the world's significant cultural places in order to enrich lives and build mutual understanding across cultures and communities. These are our values. Our values are important to us. A people-centered approach, that's very important to me, and I think it's an excellent guide for anyone trying to work in this field. And a can-do attitude, because what we're really good at is the ability to mobilize conservation field projects in many places around the world. At the moment, the numbers have gotten a little jumbled together there. We're active at not 5, but it has to be 50 or so active projects in a large number of countries. I will show you some examples of completed projects in a second. And again, an issue there with the numbers. We have about 50 people on our team working either in New York, where we're based, or in different countries who represent us, and then 400 or so people who work on specific field projects in various specialties. We are a public charity in the US, also known as a 501c3. So this means we raise all our funds for our activities from scratch every year from the general public, and also from institutions, foundations, corporations, and also some from government grant programs like the Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation of the US State Department. We use these global challenges, the set of global challenges, to organize some of our work. So I thought I would bring them here today. Number one is trying to address the major impacts of tourism on heritage places. Another one has to do with inclusive heritage, trying to improve inclusion and participation, and to be sensitive to the narratives that our projects, our sites, our selection of them promotes and perpetuates. This is a big area for the field as a whole. And then also the third one has to do with trying to work more on climate action, and in particular on adaptation and resilience. One other thing I wanted to say is that a large portion of our work originates from our so-called World Monuments Watch program, which is a program that invites nominations from the public of heritage places, and has the goal to discover those places and then spotlight and then take action on behalf of those places and their communities. And yes, there's a lot more than you can learn at wmf.org, and my email is also on the screen. If anyone would like to get in touch with me, please feel free to do so. I was also asked to say a few words on the role of the nonprofit sector in this world, which I'm happy to do. I think it's a useful distinction to make between kind of the official heritage sector and then private, nonprofit, NGO, civil society type organizations, which are terms that describe World Monuments Fund, and they also describe a lot of our partners. A lot of nominators to the World Monuments Watch program, for example, fall in this category. And what I would say that there's a kind of main benefit or main perceived benefit of that position is kind of a greater degree of flexibility and independence in being, in comparison to maybe government actors or intergovernmental agencies. Our scale also, even though in the nonprofit world we maybe a bit larger, but our small scale relatively still allows us to engage maybe with communities more directly, and then you can connect that to the ability to advocate or through the World Monuments Watch, for example, which gives us a platform to take a public position that may be a little different, a little more nuanced than that of a government, or maybe even opposed to a government. In practice, of course, a lot of these freedoms can be overstated. No organization is free from constraints, and that includes World Monuments Fund. And we, of course, can only achieve our goals through collaboration with other sectors. And especially when it comes to working on field projects, we have to do that, with agreement and permission of government agencies. So that's what I would say to that. The next thing I'd like to do is share some examples of our work that kind of show maybe our ways of working. And I have brought examples specifically involving heritage communities, and I have organized them into a few categories with an example for each. So the first one that I brought was the idea of supporting community-led initiatives, meaning supporting efforts of faith communities to take the lead in preserving their heritage places through funding and through capacity building. And my example here is a Yazidi shrine on Mount Sinjar, the reconstruction of this shrine that was destroyed by the so-called Islamic State in 2014. This is a site that came to us through the World Monuments Watch. It was nominated in the 2020 cycle by the Yazidi Organization for Documentation. So it's also an example of that connects to post-conflict reconstruction. So with the support of Alif, which is a funder of these types of projects, we were able to support a complete reconstruction of this shrine, which was celebrated late last year. Another category is the idea of promoting intercommunal cooperation, encouraging cooperation and collaboration through heritage-led initiatives. This is a project that people may know about. It took place in 2016, 2017 at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Old City of Jerusalem. I was directly involved in it. It had to do with the restoration of this building inside the church. That's the edicule of covering the tomb. And so WMF funded the larger portion of the project budget here, which was between 3 and 4 million. The total budget, so about a third of that, was funded by World Monuments Fund. And we think that in doing so, we contributed to overcoming an impasse that had been in place for almost a century. And this is a pre-restoration photo. So the shoring that you see holding up this building was installed in the late 1940s. And it was put up there to address a condition that was first observed in the 20s. So for almost a century, it was a restoration project in waiting. And that's related, of course, to the status quo of the communities of the Holy Land. So the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which was our direct partner, and then the Armenian Patriarchate and the Franciscan order. Another category that I created was the idea of promoting understanding through public education. So the idea of offering resources that promote understanding of faith-related cultural heritage, which also goes to the ideas of promoting social cohesion and celebrating diversity. The example here is a site from the 2018 cycle of the Watch, the Jewish quarter of Essaouira in Morocco, which this was a project that wanted to capture basically the stories of pluralism that characterized this society by talking to former and current community members. And there are a lot of resources on our website, like video interviews and virtual walking tour down the main road of the quarter. As another category, I have advocating, the idea of advocacy for interventions to protect faith-related cultural heritage. In this case, the Great Synagogue of Iași in Romania, another Watch site nominated by the Federation of Romanian Jewish Communities to the Watch in 2014, when an ongoing restoration project had been stalled for more than 5 years. And so we think that with the inclusion and the visibility provided by the Watch, and also with a public event that we helped organize on the top left, which we call Watch Day, the project resumed a few months later, and we were also later able to support restoration in the interior of the building, which is the photo on the right. And then as a last category, I called this one Raising Global Awareness. So it's very similar to the last one. Maybe I was running out of creativity, but it's a maybe perhaps a little less pointed and having a specific target. This is a site from the current cycle of the World Monuments Watch, the 2022 cycle, which I see Adam Markham is here. He helped. He was on the panel that helped us select this site on the Watch, the Koganu Mosque and Cemetery in the Maldives. This is the oldest and largest cemetery in the Maldives. It includes a large number of grave markers, and the gentleman in the picture is posing with, I think, 1 or 2 of the largest ones, and also 4 surviving mosques. And if you can kind of see below the limits of the picture, it of course faces the existential threat of climate change. Reminded of Dean Kite's allusion to the Marshall Islands this morning. And so it relates, I thought I would bring it here today, also to questions about international policy. There are proposals, perhaps drastic, perhaps not so drastic, about relocating communities. And so raises the question, especially for us working in this field, of what is the role of culture, of heritage, faith in these types of processes, and what does our field even have to offer in these cases. So just not saying this is happening here, but taking this as an example, what if this community decided they wanted or needed to relocate? What how do you move this? What is important about moving a cemetery? What do you take with you? Do we help you document it? Do we help you? Is it the alignment? Is the material? Questions like that. And then, do I have a few more minutes? A couple more minutes? Yeah, as I'm thinking about, I don't know, I'll go back. The heritage field, kind of more broadly with my last example, I also wanted to bring some parting thoughts, I guess, on the connection between the heritage field and religion. I think they connect a lot to Professor Hayward's presentation from this morning. So I'm speaking not necessarily from inside World Monuments Fund, but just as someone having a perspective on this world. And what I would say is that, again, like we heard a few minutes ago, if you look at the historical development of the heritage field, if you go back to maybe the wars of religion or the Enlightenment, but even more recently, the post-war period, the creation of UNESCO, or the sort of moment when a lot of institutions and methodologies consolidated in the field around the 60s, you will find a lot of these very secular assumptions embedded in it, rationalistic, scientific assumptions. And this is all well known, and it's also the history since then has been that a lot of these assumptions have been questioned in the last few decades. And what I wanted to say is that very often that has happened from a spiritual point of view. So many examples of ritual practices, many in Asia, that kind of went against the established ways of doing heritage, and other similar critiques from an indigenous point of view. And a lot of these were assimilated, a lot of these were incorporated in the field. It has had a remarkable ability to kind of do that. But I would say still it's a field that kind of struggles with religious values, still tries to maybe compartmentalize it a little bit, or kind of place it in a hierarchy, and maybe still there's an idea that it's compared, that maybe it's lower down the hierarchy compared to more kind of aesthetic, artistic value, or kind of more secular cultural value. It's a field that often is suspicious of expressions of faith in heritage places, heritage sites, and kind of sees them as a potential source of maybe harm or trouble to other types of value. And it's a field that, even though it's now very used to inviting community participation, and that includes from faith communities, still maybe struggles to relinquish expert control. So that's another reason why I think this is a very rich area of tension within the field today, and why I was very happy to be here today.
Thank you very much, Yanni. We'll go to Aviva and then to Munir. And Dr. Bushanaki, thank you for being on screen with us from Paris. It's wonderful to welcome you. So we'll go to you next, Aviva, and then to Munir, and then we'll close. Okay.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? Yes, very loud. Hi, I'm Aviva. And I'm going to start off doing a little bit more about me, not because I'm trying to tell you my resume, but because I wanted to talk about some fields in international relations a little bit for you all. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards about it, because I just remember sitting where you all, I was an IR major and I had no idea what I was going to do with it whatsoever. But I was lucky enough to kind of have a career in and out of government, but I've done my stints at the White House, was a scheduler for president. So I traveled to over 30 countries, kind of looking at, actually, a lot of it was about public diplomacy. How do you, tell messages to people? We used culture and different things, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then really found a passion for public diplomacy, and was lucky enough to end up in the State Department, as the chief of staff to the undersecretary of public diplomacy, actually Tara Sonnenschein, who works here, I believe, which is very exciting, but really getting a window into how that whole field of public diplomacy works around the world. So I'm happy to talk about that if of interest. And then from there, really decided that cultural and science diplomacy was where my passion was, and ended up at the Smithsonian Institution, and very lucky to have the role that I do. And so I wanted to say that because there are many, many ways of getting into this field and having this career. But coming to a place like the Smithsonian, I don't think from the outside I realized what a museum complex like the Smithsonian and other big museums can do in this space. So just to contextualize, I'm sure hopefully a lot of you have been to a Smithsonian, maybe in Washington or other places, but we're a trust instrumentality of the United States. So it's an unusual kind of place for a museum complex to be. We are not part of the federal government. We are independent, but we're quasi-federal because most of our funding comes from the United States. But it puts my work and the work of the Smithsonian in a very unique spot, which is, and especially globally, because we represent the American public. So we're not here to represent the American government. We don't do any policy, but we're able to speak to foreign governments representing American kind of history and values and objects. So a lot of times our office's work in international relations, we're really that kind of front door for foreign governments. So we spend our days talking to foreign ministries of science and culture and education. We work with the diplomatic corps in Washington. We are kind of the main relationship builders with the State Department and USAID and other kind of international agencies around Washington. But it's unique because in some ways foreign governments look at a Smithsonian like a de facto Ministry of Culture, because obviously we don't have a Ministry of Culture in the United States. And of course we're not that, but there's that sort of air of that. So we get a lot of, again, delegations and a lot of different people wanting to come and partner with the Smithsonian and really, again, bring the American kind of public there. And we partner a lot on capacity building and projects and different things. And so it's a really interesting place to be. We also deploy MOUs, and different kinds of mechanisms to actually create long-lasting relationships with foreign governments. I can talk about that as well. And for anyone who's interested, my office has a killer internship program that we have that's quite competitive, and a lot of people come through our office and then go into careers in this space. So I want to go back because they did ask me to talk about kind of a White House perspective on using culture. And so I can't speak for all White Houses. I can only speak to the one that I was in, but I can say, I'll focus on trips of any president. This goes across the board. I mean, when you look at kind of that bully pulpit, that way when presidents travel, what it is they're trying to do in foreign countries, I think using culture, using those messages to talk directly to people is one of the most important facets of a president. Any president can go to a country and sign agreements and have meetings and do press conferences. But the thing that lasts and the things that people really remember and the things that they connect with us, and again, our culture and our values have to do with when you do cultural activity, you go to cultural sites, you go to that famous little store that only locals would know, and how could a president know that that's the place that we all go? And those are really, really important. So I was going to tell one little story just because I thought I didn't want to hit it too spot on the nose about religion, but I happen to be the scheduler. I'm going way back in time to the year 1998 for President Clinton's trip to China. And in that day, one of the major topics that we, again, as an American president, wanted to express to the Chinese people was our interest in promoting religious freedom in a place like China. And so we spent a lot of time as a scheduler. We went actually 3 times. You kind of prepare for a trip. So we went about 3 months before. And by putting religious, we'd put churches and a particular synagogue on our list of places to see, was a signal to the Chinese government that we cared about this. Whether or not they wanted us to focus on it or not was a different story. But we said, this is what we wanted to see. So we went around to different Chinese cities. And in Shanghai is very famous in the Jewish community for having a lot of Jews from different eras who were kicked out of countries really found solace in port city of Shanghai. And there are a number of synagogues there. So we picked one, and actually, I'll be honest, at the time, we didn't understand that it wasn't functioning. It was called Ohel Rachel. And When we got there on the trip, it was actually taken over by the Chinese government as a warehouse, literal warehouse. There was nothing about it that was a synagogue. It was just a bunch of drawers and stuff. And so we walked in and it was like a warehouse, and we kind of looked around. We weren't sure what to make of it. But we decided as a team, well, we could use this opportunity to see if we can get something done here. So we said, oh, this is very interesting. I think the president might be interested in coming here. And so we came back a month later and we put it back on our schedule to go look at. And we came back and the entire place was completely cleared up. There was scaffolding inside, outside. They were cleaning the entire place up. You could see the original floor. You could see the beam. It was kind of incredible. I think I almost started crying. And then I kind of realized, well, wow, they're really taking us seriously. And now we have to do something, because we were sort of just using the opportunity to get something accomplished. And in the end, that synagogue got completely redone. And we didn't send the president, but we did send First Lady and Secretary of State Albright to actually visit it. And from that point, the Jewish community there actually was able to use it as a real synagogue. It exists today as a museum. So it's just like one example where when you travel as any American president, you can have, I think, a huge impact working with communities. If you Google that, you'll see that the Jewish community takes full credit for the fact that which as they should, that synagogue is functioning. But it was about 10 years in the making, but we were able to pull it off in about 2 months. So that was just one example. I'm gonna pivot back to my Smithsonian work and a little bit specifically about cultural heritage. And I wanted to talk a little bit just to make sure you were all aware of something from a US government perspective. So, and this is where the Smithsonian again is, we're not technically part of the US government, but we serve on something called the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee. And it's in a really important kind of new committee that launched in 2016. It came out of the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act during the Obama years. Really important that established this coordinating committee that is run out of the State Department, out of the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, which chairs it. And normally it's an interagency, it's like a whole of government interagency committee that works on cultural heritage protection. And the Smithsonian normally wouldn't be on the interagency. We were named in the bill to be a part of it. And it's just really interesting for all of you to know, because it's rare to have a whole government approach on this particular subject, but it is a mix of, you've got the State Department, you've got Department of Homeland Security, you have the FBI art crimes team, you have Customs and Border Protection, you have all the different elements of both diplomacy and law enforcement looking at the issue of the looting and trafficking of cultural heritage. It's quite fascinating. And so you look at where it's coming from, why it's happening, how it crosses borders, how once looted heritage comes into the United States, what our law enforcement mechanisms are, how we can go after it, how the State Department creates bilateral cultural property agreements with countries so that they can repatriate these objects back. This is just a whole other sub area that I work on a lot, and it is a really incredible sort of wonderful public diplomacy win-win. There's actually a lot of formal repatriations that happen through this. So that's sort of on the formal side. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the non-formal side. And at the Smithsonian, we obviously do a lot to protect cultural heritage. We do it in different ways. I'll give you just many examples. In Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine, we're using the Smithsonian's Cultural Rescue Initiative to partner using GIS and satellites to document destroyed cultural heritage, both religious sites as well as museums and other sites. And that's something funded by a consortium, Alif and others. The State Department helped fund that work, but we're sort of tracking that and sharing all that information as one example. In Iraq, and Munir can talk about this, we've worked for many, many years working in Iraq at the Erbil Conservation Institute to train conservators and museum sectors, actually working with the World Monuments Fund as well. We've probably been there for 8 years, training folks there. One of the biggest issues for us in the museum field, and I'm sure you've talked about this, is sort of the era of decolonization of our collections and our objects. That is something we're spending a lot of time discussing. Actually, at the Smithsonian, we put out a new policy, which is a bit groundbreaking, hopefully to kind of lead the sector in talking about what that means to to do ethical returns. And so, which is very different. Those are, repatriation's legal frameworks, ethical returns and shared stewardship is kind of a moral and ethical framework, which we are implementing and developing that right now. We actually did repatriate our Benin bronzes recently, but really it goes well beyond just those that are in the news. We're looking at all kinds of objects as well as human remains. I'm assuming people here know, a place like the Smithsonian has been doing repatriation of religious objects and human remains, mostly through NAGPRA, which is the Native American, I remember what the P stands for. Oh, Graves Protection and Repatriation Act from 1990. I think we've repatriated over 10,000 religious objects and human remains through our Native American History Museum, as well as natural history. But now through ethical returns, this is something a little bit larger, which is looking through, the Smithsonian has like 150 million objects in our collection. So it's gonna take a little while, but we're able, in my world, really to focus on foreign governments that are now, you've got community source communities, but ultimately when you're still giving back objects, you're still working in some ways with those foreign governments. So we have both governments coming, asking us to look at things. And in some cases, we're looking at things on our own time. And that is where I'm going to end. Look forward to talking more.
Thank you, Aviva. It's such an unenviable task to be a moderator and be forced to put up that little thing time. But taking my role seriously, I now turn it over to our next speaker, Dr. Munir Bushanaki, who's with us from Paris. Munir, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning to everyone. Let me first say how much I am pleased to participate to this seminar, to this annual meeting on religion, law and diplomacy conference. And I want to really address all my thanks to Professor Prodomo and all the staff, Costa, Sofia, Anna, for assisting me in participating online. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel because we have so many other obligations, particularly in this time of crisis and particularly the Ukraine war. So I would like to concentrate on the main topics that, like my colleagues, my friend Yanis and also the colleague Aviva, have concentrated on, first of all, the role of the institutions where they are working, and which, unfortunately, we are also linked with both the World Monuments Fund and also with the Smithsonian, as you know well. So the role of the two organizations where I was lucky to work for a long time, 25 years at UNESCO, 6 years as Director General of ICROM. These organizations, which are intergovernmental, are having a very important role in the field of conservation, in the field of awareness and participation in programs concerning the protection of cultural heritage. And UNESCO, which was created in November 1945 in London, was in the beginning having as a motto this phrase that I'm reading: since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So this was really the original phrase that on which was built the Constitution of UNESCO, which has 5 important departments: education, science, culture, communication, and social sciences. I was in charge of the sector of culture and the sector of cultural heritage, and in particular, world heritage, which is one of the flagship of UNESCO in all the world, because we have actually, thanks to the Convention of 1972 concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. I insist on this combination, which was very unique at that time, 50 years ago, bringing together culture and nature it was an important new development and new concept that is now applicable in a number of countries. So UNESCO has, in a very short phrase, 2 important missions. One is the normative mission. And the normative mission in the field in which I worked is defined by the conventions and recommendations. And we have now a number of important conventions which are mostly agreed by the large number of countries. The Convention of 1972 is the one which has 194 countries signatory, that means the whole world. The others are going on slowly. The first one was 1954 convention called the Hague Convention for the protection of the cultural heritage in times of conflict. It was an important convention because it was written by those lawyers who were unfortunately being, looking at what has happened during the Second World War and all the destruction of towns and cities, of millions of victims, and the heritage of the population. The second convention is the Convention of 1970, and I'm glad that Ms. Aviva recorded what UNESCO is doing in close consultation and cooperation with the government of the United States, but also with the Smithsonian. This Convention of 1970 is the one which is helping countries, institutions, and particularly museums to recuperate the artifacts which are stolen. So it is a convention against the illicit traffic of cultural property. The third convention, I will not repeat, is the most popular one, 1972 convention concerning the World Cultural and Natural Heritage. The fourth convention is the Convention of 2001, which is still at the stage of more development and more sensitization, is the convention concerning the protection of the underwater cultural heritage, 2001. Then we have the Convention of 2003, which is becoming, again, a very popular convention. The 2003 convention is for the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage. And finally, the latest convention of UNESCO is the Convention of 2005 concerning the protection of cultural diversity, of the expression of cultural diversity. So this convention for the lawyers, and in particular to our colleague, Mr. Joe Klingler, is constituting a kind of framework of international agreements concerning culture and cultural heritage. The second mission that UNESCO was launching, it was 60 years ago, the creation of an institution dealing with cultural heritage, but on a more technical aspect. This is ICCROM. ICCROM is the International Center for Conservation and Research in the Field of Cultural Property. It is established in Rome, in the capital of Italy, and I was lucky to be the elected Director General of ICCROM, which is an institution dealing mainly with research on cultural heritage, all aspects of cultural heritage, tangible, intangible, movable, immovable, and the sensitization and the training. Training is constituting, since the creation of ICCROM, the pillar of all activities that we are doing in a number of countries. So this is very quickly the role of such multilateral intergovernmental institution. But these institutions, and I can speak by experience, we were not able to work alone. So my second point is the dynamic of governance between such organization, governmental and non-governmental organizations. And here I can name the World Monuments Fund. We are very, very closely associated to the work of the World Monuments Fund. ICOM, the International Council of Museums. ICOMOS, the International Council of Monuments and Sites. The Smithsonian, of course, the Nara and Tokyo Institute. I mean, we have now a network of such international specialized institutions in the field of cultural heritage, and we are working very closely, and I will give some examples very soon. Now, in my personal experience, I have been involved in many projects. One I can consider as positive projects which were highlighting the value of cultural heritage in a number of countries. And it was called, during the 80s and the 90s, international campaigns for the safeguarding of cultural heritage. I was involved in the launching of an international campaign in the continuation of the international campaign launched in Venice about the protection of Venice against the flooding, against the number of damages done by this high-rise level, the acque alte, as it is said in Italy. This campaign of Venice was associating private institutions, the American Society for Venice, the British Society for Venice, the French Association for Venice, and we were just coordinating the work done in the churches, in the palaces, in the museums, with the government of Italy, and mainly with the Ministry of Culture of Italy. The second campaign, which was another very successful campaign, was the end of the campaign concerning the safeguarding and the restoration of very huge heritage in Egypt, and it is called the International Campaign for the Safeguarding of Abu Simbel and Philae in Egypt. And it was continued by a second campaign that I had the honor to lead about the creation of two new museums in Egypt, one in the south of Egypt, which is called the Nubia Museum, which is the summary of the campaign, and another one in Cairo, which was just inaugurated, I think, last year by the president of Egypt, the Museum of Egyptian Civilization. And we were also asked as the advisor for the new museum, which will be probably inaugurated this year, by the end of this year, the Gem Museum, which is the Pharaonic Museum in Egypt. And I was like this following a number of campaigns which were done, for example, in Nepal for the Kathmandu Valley, in Peru for San Francisco de Lima, in Morocco for the city of Fez, the Medina of Fez. And always in these campaigns, we were using the two important elements, which was the elements of restoring, rehabilitating, but also an element linked to the development of people, the training of people in the field, and also the economic aspect, because all these sites, once they were rehabilitated, they were opening their doors for tourism. But here also, we were very keen to develop a vision of cultural tourism. What are the difficulties? I spoke about some positive aspect. The difficulties is what we have seen, and I was really present about the first time in the recent history of humanity that a World Heritage Site was targeted and partially destroyed. It was the city of Dubrovnik in the former Yugoslavia. And then I followed all the process of the unfortunate war in former Yugoslavia, and I was in charge, in particular, of the campaign for restoring the city of Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Why we were very keen in following the demand, as Yanis said, of the local population, when they have seen that the city was all destroyed. The churches, the mosques, the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, everything was destroyed. I have a lot of documents and paper about this. The symbolic aspect that was asked by the population was, can you help us rebuild the bridge of Mostar? And the rebuilding of the bridge of Mostar, using exactly the same technique as it was done in the 16th century, the same material, even the cave from where the stones were used in the 16th century. This was the way to reestablish the link between the communities, the acceptance of the other. The Catholic Church was restored, the Orthodox Church was restored, the mosques were restored, and we consider that this is an example of tolerance and an example of how cultural heritage can be a tool for bringing more acceptation of the other. I had similar examples, of course. For example, we restored, and I was in charge of this project, and it was a kind of symbolic project. We restored the oldest synagogue in the Medina of Fez. And I presented this project when I was in Jerusalem, and some people in the room were telling me, but you know, UNESCO is against Israel. And I said, no, UNESCO is a non-political organization, and we are working for all communities. We're working with the Buddhists in Cambodia. We are working with the Islamic community in Afghanistan after the destruction of the Buddha of Bamiyan. We are working with the Jewish community in protecting the museum, the Jewish museum in Sarajevo, and also in protecting Jewish heritage. And I signed an agreement with Bezalel University in Jerusalem to make an inventory of the Jewish heritage in the world. So this is the role of UNESCO in the situation of crisis. Of course, I can mention now what I am still following, like the city of Mosul, which was totally destroyed by Daesh. Now we are working on a project, again, very symbolic, restoration of two churches, the Clock Church and the Taheret Church, and the main mosque of Mosul. Why we are doing this project all together is to try to redone to the population the feeling that they can live again together as they were living for centuries. So these are very quickly, because time is running, and I have, of course, as you can imagine, more and more to say about this. And I want just to end by thanking Professor Prodomu. We met in New York in September last year at the places of His Sanctity, the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox, and we discussed another issue that UNESCO was trying to address and to find some kind of solution for leaving a site which has an extraordinary value, an exceptional value, the Hagia Sophia, which was for 70 years a museum since Ataturk, and then with the decision of the present president of the Republic, become a mosque. So I was sent 2 times by UNESCO to discuss with the authorities and to see in which way this site should keep the value when it was inscribed as a World Heritage Site and when it was a museum. And Professor Prodromou, warned me, and I, of course, warned my colleagues at UNESCO in order to see what are the new challenges that we are facing with in the Hagia Sophia monuments. So these are very quickly what I want to say, and I want to say that the heritage management from the part of UNESCO has to be done in coordination with others, and in particular with the new foundation, which is called ALIF Foundation, with its base in Geneva, Switzerland. And I have been chosen recently as interim president of the scientific committee of ALIF. So I am following since the beginning of the war in Ukraine with all the requests by museum experts in Ukraine, by responsible of historic monuments, by the responsible of the archives, and we are giving a lot of support. We are nearly about $4 million of support to cultural heritage of Ukraine in this very difficult period. And finally, we are now faced with the natural disaster in Turkey and in Syria, and we will see very, very soon how to do what we have done in many other situations. I remember then I was working with the secretary of the Smithsonian in Haiti when there was the terrible earthquake in Haiti in 2011. And I worked very closely with Dr. Richard Curran, my friend Richard Curran, and ICROM when I was director of ICROM. And we initiated a concrete program altogether between the Smithsonian and ICROM for the safeguarding of the cultural heritage of Haiti. As I said, I want to say many more things, but I think time is already running for me. I want to express my thanks again to Professor Perdomo, and I hope that my next, in your 8th annual conference, I will be in person with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us from Paris, Munir. We're going to our final speaker, Joe Klingler. And one thing I wanted to call to our attention is that everyone up here and on screen has talked about what unites in terms of the protection, preservation of cultural heritage. And yet it's very clear that there are those who don't comply and don't support the view that local heritage and particular heritage is also universal heritage, and that the protection of specific heritage is a gift not only to that particular community, but to the global community and to all humanity. And I think those who don't comply and where there's contestation and disagreement takes us to our final speaker, Joe Klingler, who works on litigation and arbitration. So we look forward to hearing from you now, Joe.
Thank you. So my name is Joe Klingler. I'm a partner at Foley Hoag, which is a global law firm in the International Litigation and Arbitration Department, where I represent sovereign states in public international law disputes of a variety of kinds, including more recently a dispute involving the destruction of cultural heritage. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But I've been asked to talk about four different topics. The first is what international law says about the protection of cultural heritage. And so here there's a little bit of overlap with what Dr. Buccinacchi was saying. So I'll focus on particular, I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on two of the conventions that he mentioned. But in short, I would say the answer is it has a lot to say. International law has a lot to say about the protection of cultural heritage. Could it say more? Of course, but it does have a lot to say. Two prominent instruments that Dr. Buccinacchi mentioned are the Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, 1972, and then the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. And there's all sorts of provisions in these conventions that are designed to protect cultural heritage, as you'd expect. Just to give a few examples. So Article 4 of the 1972 convention says, quote, each state party to this convention recognizes that the duty of ensuring the identification, protection, conservation, presentation, and transmission to future generations of the cultural and natural heritage referred to in Articles 1 and 2. So that's where it's defined. And situated on its territory belongs primarily to the state, right? And the state then will, quote, do all it can to this end to the utmost of its own resources. So that's a legal obligation that parties to the convention commit to, and they're required to comply with it. Of course, the extent to which they do so varies from state to state, but I think as a general rule, states do tend to comply. Now, obviously, a statement like that can be contested, and we see certain conspicuous examples of international law being, flagrantly violated, and that tends to lead people to think, okay, well, what does international law matter? But there's a famous adage by Professor Sohn, I believe it was, and you may have heard it, that 99% of countries follow international law 99% of the time, right? And I think that is probably true. You do have these flagrant examples where it's not followed, and those stand out. But as a general rule, I think that states do try to comply. So another article in that convention would be, quote, each state party to this convention undertakes not to take any deliberate measures which might cause damage directly or indirectly to the cultural and natural heritage as defined in the convention. Turning to the 1954 convention, and this one is obviously focused on protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict in particular. Article 4.1 says the high contracting parties undertake to respect cultural property situated within their own territory, as well as within the territory of the other high contracting parties, by refraining from any use of the property and its immediate surroundings for purposes which are likely to expose it to destruction or damage in the event of armed conflict, and by refraining from any act of hostility towards such property, right? So you can't, for example, be stationing your troops, shooting artillery from a protected cultural heritage site, right? If you do that, you're violating the convention. So those are just two examples. Now, one convention that isn't, or at least in the past, hasn't been thought of as much in this context, but is definitely relevant, is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So Article 1.1 of that convention, it defines racial discrimination in connection with, quote, the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. And then Article 5 goes on to specifically protect equal enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, including in particular the right to equal enjoyment in cultural activities, right? So in essence, this means that it protects against discrimination in relation to human rights, including cultural rights, which of course relates to the protection of cultural heritage. That means that under the convention, you can't go out and on the basis of ethnicity, for example, go and be destroying cultural heritage that you associate with a particular ethnicity, right? And then the final thing I would mention in terms of what international law has to say about cultural heritage and the protection of cultural heritage in particular is customary international law, which can be very easily overlooked, but it's really important in the sense that customary international law, unless of course you're a persistent objector, it binds you whether or not you've signed up to a convention, right? So you may not be a party to a particular treaty, but it may bind you, or aspects of it may bind you as a matter of customary international law, whether or not you have signed up. And so again, international law has a lot to say about these things. So that brings me to my second topic, which is the role of international arbitration in resolving disputes, in particular at the UN or other bodies. So I'll do so in connection with the three conventions that I just discussed. So turning to the Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, the 1972 Convention, there's no dispute settlement clause, okay? So there's no way to seek a binding third-party resolution of disputes between parties. Now, this is of course a problem when it comes to that 1% of the cases where it's not being complied with. It does present a problem. And it presents a problem in that 1% of cases in international law more generally. So it's not just a problem when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage. When it comes to the 1954 Hague Convention, Article 22.1 provides that the protected powers shall lend their good offices in all cases where they may deem it useful in the interests of cultural property. In particular, if there's a disagreement between the parties to the conflict as to the application of the convention, right? So good offices are essentially, conciliation. They can try to mediate the dispute. There's a similar conciliation procedure under the second optional protocol of that convention. And then under the regulations for the execution of the convention, there can be arbitration over objections to the registration of cultural property on what's called the International Register of Cultural Property under special protection. But importantly, there's no binding dispute settlement clause more generally, right? And that means that under the 1954 Hague Convention, states cannot, for example, bring a claim against other states for the destruction of cultural heritage and have a court or tribunal order that other state to do or not do something. And that brings me finally to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. And importantly, it does allow parties to resort to either the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, that's under Article 11, and that can lead to the creation of what's called a conciliation committee, and it conciliates, so mediates the dispute. But you can also go to the International Court of Justice. And the International Court of Justice can, of course, issue binding rulings or orders on parties to disputes before it. So to give an example, Armenia is one of the parties that one of my firm's clients, and I'm representing Armenia myself in these proceedings, has brought claims against Azerbaijan under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, among other reasons being that it has sought to systematically destroy Armenian cultural heritage in areas that it controls. So perhaps most famously, some of you may be aware of this, but Azerbaijan destroyed virtually all Armenian cultural heritage in Nakhichevan, which is a particular part of Azerbaijan, including numerous churches and the famous Old Juga Cemetery, which has thousands of what are called kachkars. They're distinctive Armenian cross stones that have been recognized by UNESCO as forming part of intangible cultural heritage. It's also erased inscriptions on Armenian churches, and it's begun presenting them as Caucasian Albanian rather than Armenian in an effort to kind of deny the historical link of ethnic Armenians to these areas. Now, after the recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh, which happened in 2020, Azerbaijan acquired control over new territory, and it began destroying churches and graveyards and other Armenian monuments there as well. So when Armenia brought claims under the convention before the International Court of Justice, it asked the court to issue what are called provisional measures, so emergency measures ordering, before pending resolution of the dispute on the merits, emergency measures saying, hey, don't do that. And in 2021 December, the court ordered Azerbaijan to, quote, take all necessary measures to prevent and punish acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage, including but not limited to churches and other places of worship, monuments, landmarks, cemeteries, and artifacts. So Azerbaijan has unfortunately continued to do so. So this is going to be a subject for resolution before the court moving forward, in particular at the merits stage of the case. So the final subject, am I okay on time? I hope I'm not too, yeah, okay. Final subject I was asked to briefly discuss is just the practical aspects of my work, and how, in particular, how firms like my own receive clients and begin cases. So this extends a little bit beyond just cultural heritage, although it's of course relevant. So as a general rule, firms receive clients through the relationships of the attorneys with contact persons in the governments. I'm speaking particularly about my practice, which is representing countries, or through the firm's reputation. I mean, that's a big one. Because there's very, very few firms that have any significant practice representing states before, in particular, the International Court of Justice, but also in interstate proceedings more generally, whether they're litigation or arbitration. There's just very, very few. So if you're a state considering bringing such a claim, there aren't a lot of options, particularly if you want like a well-resourced firm. When it comes to the case against Azerbaijan, Foley was a natural fit because we had been involved with proceedings under the CERD, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, in the past. So Georgia versus Russia, also Qatar against its neighbors, UAE, Egypt. That was just against the UAE. So we were kind of a natural fit for doing this case as well. And then more generally, the decision about whether or not to bring a case is typically, it's a political one. I mean, the government has to have the political will to bring the case or have the case be brought against it, right? And in that case, they just have to defend themselves. Once the decision is made, however, certain steps typically need to be taken depending on what the treaty requires. So for example, under the CERD, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, it's necessary to either resort to the CERD committee to seek conciliation of the dispute before you go to the International Court of Justice, or to make what's called a genuine attempt to negotiate with the other party before approaching the court. In our case, we sought to negotiate with Azerbaijan, but the negotiations reached an impasse, and we therefore initiated proceedings before the court. Of course, different treaties have different requirements. Some don't require any form of negotiations. A party can simply institute proceedings against any other party. But very commonly, treaties require the parties to first try to settle their disputes with the other party. I'll end there.
All right, thank you for fantastic kind of tour de force of the international legal frameworks and the way that states in particular have, I would say, an advantage when it comes to issues related to cultural heritage protection or lack thereof. So I hope we'll have a discussion on what that means for non-state groups that would like to either ask for inscription or protection. We have about 14 minutes left in this session. I have a host of questions myself, but I'm going to close my mouth and turn it over to all of you. I invite you to ask a question. Please remember that a question ends with a question mark, and try to be as brief and synoptic as possible so that we can hear from all of our panelists. Yeah, why don't we start way in the back and then we'll come down. Okay.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful panel, and I'm sure the rest of the conference will keep up with that. So first of all, also let me say that my name is Ibrahim Warde. I teach a few courses here at the Fletcher School, and it's great to see Professor Prodromo here. We haven't seen you in a while, Elizabeth. It's great seeing you. And the students did a great job organizing all this. So the question I have is slightly outside of the topic, but you'll see that it has some relevance. As you know, the tragic earthquakes in Turkey and Syria have affected a number of historical / cultural / religious monuments. And so to extend slightly, obviously the implicit assumption of this panel is we're looking at like man-made or kind of event that were caused by war and human involvement. So in what's happening now in place, especially I'm thinking of Antioch, which was a center of early Christianity, and all three major monotheistic religions have been affected by what has happened. So does anybody has some thoughts on the ways in which like acts of God can be addressed through what is usually discussed in terms of, again, trying to deal with the government actors, etc. Thank you.
I'll take that and then maybe I'll pass it to you. I mean, first of all, yes, this is happening in real time. It is incredible tragedy. And I'll circle back to something Munir said in a second, but just in terms of a real life tragedy like that, I mean, I think we would all agree, obviously the human aspect is what comes first, and that's happening now. But eventually, actually, there will be a mechanism by which a lot of people all over the world can participate in helping. And it usually does stem from, though, the government asking for support. So most people don't rush, people don't rush in to sort of help unless they are asked. So there's a lot of amazing mechanisms by which that actually happens. And then you would find so many organizations coming with their various specialties, depending on what is needed, what's been destroyed, how it can be supported. So you can talk a little bit about how you do that, but that is something that will absolutely, it's already happened, to be honest. I know for the Smithsonian, we've already been reached out by the State Department and other governments. But something that Munir brought up, just when you kind of look back at a situation, we talked about Haiti. That was similar situation with an earthquake. And what's interesting about why that's so powerful in the end is, this is a quote from the former USAID head at the time who worked on Haiti. And he said, USAID mounted, he said, the largest humanitarian effort ever post Haiti earthquake. And he talked about all the millions and millions and millions of dollars that they poured into rebuilding power and all the different infrastructure. And he said the only thing people wanted to talk to him about was how we protected cultural heritage in Haiti, period. Like that's what they remembered after the fact. So it is very powerful afterwards. And of course you need to save lives and rebuild, but it's actually rebuilding cultural heritage is what, again, people remember from their tragedy because it's what they care so deeply about.
Sure, yes, yes, you summarized it very well. I know these discussions are taking place. The international system, the UN system, has a process for doing post-disaster needs assessment, and that includes culture. And as Professor Dromu said, culture broadly defined, so not just damage to monuments, but people's access to libraries and religious sites and places of worship. So I'm sure all of that will be happening. Obviously, after the search and rescue and the end of the immediate emergency. And so this will just be a personal comment, but I've found it, very hard in the last few days to even, think about or concentrate on, damage to sites. I mean, the kind of humanitarian needs, I think, are so overwhelming and have to come first.
Munir, I don't know if you'd like to jump in on this at all. Oh, I guess you cannot hear me.
Yes,
Okay,
I am listening. I am totally in agreement with my two predecessors, Aviva and Yanis, because we used, unfortunately, to have, in addition to the crises which are man-made, we have, as your colleague spoke, we have difficulties in replying, of course, to the natural disasters. But we are faced with such disasters. I remember the earthquake which affected the city of Cairo. What we did, we sent immediately a mission on the spot to make what we call the first assessment, and then to prepare a plan of action to do the urgent measure of consolidating, as Aviva said, we of course we come after the first missions which are already on the stop in Turkey and Syria for the safeguarding of the population. Now we have reached, unfortunately, 21,000 people died in these two terrible earthquakes, but we have already, I was in contact with the ambassador of Turkey and the ambassador of Syria, and we know that in Syria, the citadel of Aleppo was affected. We know that in Gaziantep is a very important city where we have absolutely magnificent mosaics and the remains of very, very high prosperity near the Euphrates. We know that Antioquia, as it was said by during the question, is one of the important sites of where we find, of course, the three religions. And we know already by these contacts, which are quite of informal contacts, that UNESCO and all the other institutions will be coordinating efforts in order to save, first of all, to assess the situation and then to launch a program of safeguarding. This is what we did in Kathmandu when there was 3 years ago, if I remember well, a very, very heavy earthquake. This is something that we are unfortunately used to face with a similar approach. And Aviva is reminding us about the action which was really in the field for many months and many years in Haiti. So this is what we can reply to your colleague, saying that everybody is now, because of the television, because of the social media, everybody in the world is now very well aware. But the first act now is to collect contributions, to find the resources, and then to mobilize teams to be on the spot.
A brief footnote. I wanted to read a message yesterday that I received this is from the Development and Ecumenical Relations Department, the humanitarian arm of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch. They said, hundreds of people remain stuck in debris of collapsed buildings. Families as a whole have passed away. We pray for mercy on Syria as it can no longer bear the suffering. And I read that message because I think in terms of natural disasters or man-made disasters, the politics of relief and the politics of preservation and sustainability always come to the forefront. And how relief may or may not be delivered will depend a lot on the international community's response to Syria versus Turkey, Syria and Turkey, and to the two governments themselves. So I wanted to share that with you. There's a question in the back there, and then we'll come down here to the front.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. It's been really incredible hearing from all of your experiences and insights. And this question is a little bit more directed towards Mr. Klinger, but I was wondering, for cases where the states don't consent to conciliation or arbitration, is the ICJ the only forum where they can be, the cases can be filed and taken forward? Because I do know that here is very few cases every year, and I'm sure that there's many more issues that states might not consent to talking through with their counterparts because of antagonism or ethnic and racial issues.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that having a forum for international litigation or arbitration, having a court or tribunal with jurisdiction is always consent-based, without exception. And that's even before the International Court of Justice. So before the International Court of Justice, you can't bring a claim as a general rule, and there's a caveat to it, but you generally cannot bring a claim against another state before the International Court of Justice just because it's the International Court of Justice. What you need is a treaty that both sides are party to, in which they have consented to have the International Court of Justice hear the dispute, right? The exception to that is if you're a state that's party to what's called the optional protocol to the statute of the International Court of Justice, and that gives the court general jurisdiction over disputes between the parties. But even there, that is still consent-based, right? Because you have consented to the general jurisdiction of the court, so to speak. So the answer is, you always need consent. I think that's unfortunate, and I wish that all parties to all member states of the UN were members of the optional protocol or had signed the optional protocol, but that's just unfortunately not the case. So you do always need consent.
Is there a question down here initially? Yes, right now.
Hello, thank you all for being here. It was a very insightful conversation. First of all, I just want to say thank you all for your good wishes for Turkey. We are dealing with a lot, but we will get through it, I hope. And just saying that there are a lot of fundraisers. We really appreciate the international cooperation, but also don't be afraid of approaching a Turkish person or a Syrian person, because we have connections within the country. And even though international aid is coming to the country, because of logistic issues, so few aid is going to the places that are needed. So just bear that in mind. I wanted to ask, not all of the states recognize the ICJ or are not part of it, or how does it work with them? Can they be still brought to the court, or how does the court also enforce the jurisdictions that go through it, and how do they make sure that countries actually do abide by the rulings?
Yeah, and those are great and deep questions. With respect to the first one, parties to the member states of the UN are parties to the statute of the court. So in that sense, they're automatically, but the issue is that even, just being member state of the UN, unless again, you've signed this optional protocol that I mentioned, you still need a separate treaty that will give the court, or a separate agreement of some kind that will give the court jurisdiction. So, now in terms of enforcement, this is a notorious, you could teach, seminars on this. Enforcement, strictly speaking, the court doesn't have a power to, it doesn't have an army. It can't send an army to go, it can't send the police as domestic courts can do, right? Now, theoretically, it can refer things to the Security Council, and the Security Council can order, and the Security Council could theoretically authorize the use of military force. That could happen. I think as a practical matter, it's much more likely that it kind of, a judgment of the court is, I think, is generally taken very seriously by states. Again, there are notorious exceptions, right? When it's in what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now being a good example of that. But it comes at a great political cost to do that. And I think that is often the primary mechanism of enforcement. And I do think it very often works. But if the perceived interests of this state that doesn't like the judgment, if it perceives its interest in not complying as being high enough to bear that political cost, which can be high, maybe it will choose to do so.
We have time for one last question. Oh, here in the back.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm asking a question for Baba online. They were wondering about the difference between preservation of tangible and intangible heritage, and how you approach doing those two things.
How to begin with this? It's an excellent question. For our practice at World Monuments Fund, we say that we work on monuments and sites, so that you could call that tangible, and not just tangible, but actually immovable heritage, to distinguish it from collections and archives and those sorts of objects. The truth is, these things are very fluid between each other. There's, the values that animate any object of heritage interest are of course, intangible in themselves. So that's, they're very hard to separate, I would say. And the other point that I would make in connection to this question is, it's of course it's the richness that comes from the interaction, you obviously don't want to. Everybody understands the importance of focusing on the intangible. You also don't want to sort of miss the material object and maybe the spatial. That's what gives a lot of sort of monuments their importance in people's lives, and their legitimacy and their power is their material and spatial aspects. So you have to think about both, is my answer.
I would just add, I guess for us, it would be like the race to research and document. I think that would be an answer. I know, presenting intangible cultural heritage is wonderful, but if you don't document it and you don't sort of research it, and people can go back in time and be able to actually utilize that information, then it's basically lost. For us, that's something that we focus on. As I see we are at time, but what we focus on to be able to document.
Okay, I think we are at time. Can I add another T word though to time, which is training? And I think in funding, particularly with bilateral state-to-state MOUs, but also between museums and local communities, it's really important to build in funding for training to learn the techniques and also the skills that are necessary for the preservation of intangible heritage, but also the sustainability and the perpetuation of those local communities. And that's where the private sector also can play either a constructive or a destructive role. So I'm sorry, we're out of time because I see more questions. Thank you so much to all of our participants here in person and to Dr. Bushanaki on screen. Thank you to all of you. And again, to the students. I think we have a quick break, drink your coffee quickly and come back for another wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Hello, everyone. I think you can hear me okay. We'll take a quick 10-minute break right now. I'm glad the topic of Turkey came up. We actually have a booth selling Turkish sort of desserts and coffee outside. It'll be a fundraiser for relief in Turkey. So if you see it on the way out, please stop by, and we'll begin our next panel at 11:30. Thanks.